The wind across the steppe was not a gentle wind. It was sharp, it was cold, it carried the voices of ancestors and the cries of the dying. It swept endlessly across the barren earth, whispering the story of a boy who would rise from hunger and exile to rule the largest empire the world had ever seen. His name would become a curse and a legend, Genghis Khan. But behind the thunder of hooves, behind the cities set aflame and the army slaughtered, there was another story that history tried to bury. It is a story written in silence, in shadows, in the wombs of women who bore children into a destiny they never chose. Temujin, as he was first called, was not born into greatness. He was born into fear. His father, Yesagay, was a chieftain, but power among the steppe tribes was fragile, like frost melting under a weak sun. When Yesagay was poisoned by rivals, Temujin's family was cast out, left to fend for themselves in the merciless wilderness. Hunger gnawed at them. Betrayal taught him that kinship was an illusion. His mother, Holan, fought like a wolf to keep her children alive, scraping roots from frozen ground, tearing strips of meat from wild rodents, anything to survive another day. Temujin learned early that mercy was a lie, that compassion brought nothing but ruin. The boy who grew up in starvation learned that to live, he would have to seize what others possessed, even if it was not his by right. But within this harsh upbringing, there were moments of tenderness. There was Berta, the girl he was promised to as a wife. She would become his queen, his confidant, perhaps the only true human bond he ever held on to. Their marriage began as an alliance, yet through their shared struggles, it grew into something more. A partnership bound by fire and exile. But in the cruel world of the steppe, nothing was safe, not even love. One night, raiders descended on their camp, enemies from a rival tribe. They stole Bordy away, dragging her into captivity. For months she was gone, her fate unknown, her body belonging to another world of silence and terror. When Temujin finally fought to reclaim her, Berta returned with child. That child, Yoshi, would forever be haunted by whispers. Was he Temujin's blood or the son of Berta's captors? The truth was never known, but the doubt festered like poison, marking Yoshi's life and shadowing the politics of succession within the Khan's dynasty. Even among his brothers, suspicion lingered. To Temujin, the abduction of Berta carved an unshakable lesson into his soul. If even his beloved wife could be taken, then women were never safe, never beyond the grasp of power. From that moment forward, women would not only be wives or companions in his mind. They became symbols of dominance, pawns in the game of conquest, the flesh through which he proved his supremacy over enemies. As Temujin transformed into Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, his hunger did not stop at borders and fortresses. It reached into households, into families, into the bodies of women who became unwilling trophies of his victories. Marriage became a weapon. To take the daughter of a defeated king was to annihilate that king's legacy. To seize the wife of a rival ruler was to extinguish his bloodline forever. Genghis Khan built his empire not only through slaughter, but through the possession of women. His queens were displayed as emblems of prestige, his concubines filled the chambers of his palace, and his countless captives became forgotten shadows. The chronicles rarely gave them names, rarely acknowledged their suffering, yet they were the silent foundation upon which his dynasty expanded. For Genghis Khan, conquest was not complete until it was intimate. To burn a city was only one part of victory. To extinguish its ruler's line by taking his wives and daughters was the final blow. And so from China to Persia, from the Khwarezmian Empire to the farthest edges of Central Asia, women were seized. They were placed in silk, given attendance, or else discarded into silence. They bore children who carried Mongol bloodlines into dynasties that reshaped the world. Their lives were never their own again, their voices swallowed by the hunger of empire. Yet within this vast silence, one truth remained undeniable. Through these women, willingly or unwillingly, Genghis Khan planted his lineage into the soil of history itself. Centuries later, scientists would uncover what chronicles only hinted. In 2003, geneticists traced a Y chromosome lineage that originated in Mongolia around the time of the Khan. Today, nearly 1 in 200 men alive carry this genetic marker. 16 million men scattered across the earth, living testaments to a legacy carved through power and conquest. 16 million men walking today with his blood inside them. 16 million, not by accident, but by design. His empire spread across borders, but his blood spread through women whose names the world never kept. The true conquest of Genghis Khan was not land. It was lineage. The legacy of Genghis Khan was written in more than maps, more than armies. It was etched into human flesh, into the blood of those who had no choice but to carry his empire forward. His soldiers swept like storms across the earth, and with every storm came silence, a silence born in the aftermath of screams. Cities fell, their walls crumbled, their treasures looted, and when the fires died down, the women remained. They were no longer daughters of princes, wives of governors, or mothers of warriors. They became property of the conqueror. Some were given to his sons and generals as tokens of loyalty. Some were carried into his palace, their names erased, their futures stolen. To the Khan, they were not individuals, they were vessels, their very existence reduced to the continuation of his seed. When he turned his gaze toward the Khwarezmian Empire, the campaign was brutal beyond measure. Whole cities were annihilated, their streets running with blood. The Shah's court crumbled in chaos, his family scattered in terror. The women of that empire, noble and common alike, were gathered, divided, and distributed. For the Mongols, to conquer a people meant to consume them fully. The men were slaughtered, the artisans enslaved, the women taken. In this way, no rival legacy survived. The conqueror did not merely end dynasties with the sword, he ended them by folding their bloodlines into his own. The chronicles written by Persian and Chinese scholars record this pattern in whispers, rarely in detail, for even they seem to shudder at what it revealed. But again and again, the evidence is the same. Mongol conquest did not stop at walls. It entered homes, bedrooms, and wombs. For every city reduced to ash, there were women carried off into silence. Genghis Khan's empire expanded not just outward across the map, but inward into the veins of the conquered. It is said that his sons, grandsons, and generals followed his example, spreading Mongol lineage into every land they touched. Across Asia, noble families suddenly bore children with Mongol blood. Across Persia, new dynasties rose. Their claim to power traced back not through treaties, but through the fact that their mothers, willingly or unwillingly, had been taken by the Khan's men. And yet among this ocean of silence, there were women whose influence could not be erased. Berta remained by his side, her position secure despite the scars of her abduction. She was the first among his queens, a figure of dignity within a court ruled by fear. She held authority within the empire, and her sons became heirs to his vast legacy. His daughters, too, wielded a rare and formidable power. In a world where most women were excluded from politics, the daughters of Genghis Khan commanded territories, led armies, and ruled with iron authority in their father's name. They were feared in their own right, remembered not as victims, but as rulers. But even their power was built upon the suffering of the nameless, the unrecorded women who filled the shadows of the Mongol court. The empire grew, swallowing kingdoms, toppling dynasties, erasing cultures. But while the chronicles speak of battles and victories, they do not speak of the nights after the fires burned out, when women taken from palaces and villages alike were forced to submit to the conqueror's will. Their silence is the wound history refuses to show, and yet it lingers, hidden in blood. Centuries later, when geneticists traced the Y chromosome back to Mongolia, the discovery was staggering. 16 million men alive today, nearly 1 in every 200, carry a marker that points back to Genghis Khan. This number is too vast to have come from one marriage, too immense to be explained by mere chance. It proves what the chronicles whispered and what survivors feared. The empire of the Mongols was not only carved into geography, but into humanity itself. The conquest of women was as deliberate as the conquest of cities. Think of it, 16 million living men, each a thread reaching back to one man who believed the world was his to devour. The scale of this legacy is haunting. It means that every marketplace, every crowded street, Every gathering today may hold descendants of the Khan, carrying his blood without even knowing it. His armies perished, his palaces crumbled, his banners fell, but his blood endured. His truest conquest was not of land, but of lineage. Yet behind this genetic triumph lies the shadow no one can escape. Every lineage was born of a woman whose choice was stripped away, a woman absorbed into silence. Some lived in luxury, adorned with silks and jewels, but silks cannot erase captivity. Others were discarded, forgotten even as they carried the blood of an empire within them. Their voices did not survive the chronicles. Their names are not in the records. Their faces do not appear in paintings. And yet they are the unseen mothers of millions. What, then, is the legacy of Genghis Khan? Is it the vast trade networks he opened, the Silk Road brought to life under the Pax Mongolica? Is it the brilliance of his strategies, his unrivaled ability to forge unity among fractured tribes? Or is it this quieter, more intimate conquest, the one that unfolded in the shadows, one woman at a time, until his blood saturated the world? His empire has long since vanished, but his lineage remains, whispering across centuries in the lives of 16 million men who carry his mark. The true conquest of Genghis Khan was not just war, it was the conquest of memory itself. For while his name is celebrated or cursed, the women who bore his empire have been forgotten. They remain only as echoes, their lives erased, their children scattered, their stories lost to the silence of history. The empire may be gone, but the silence endures. The silence of history is often more terrifying than its noise. We know of the battles because chroniclers describe them in vivid detail. Walls tumbling under siege engines, rivers clogged with corpses, skies darkened by arrows. We know of the politics, the treaties, the betrayals, the rise and fall of dynasties. But what we do not hear, what history refuses to tell us, are the voices of the women whose lives were claimed in the shadow of conquest. They are not absent because they were unimportant. They are absent because they were silenced, reduced to nameless figures in the backdrop of empire. And yet their silence has endured longer than the empire itself, woven into the bloodlines of millions who walk the earth today. When Genghis Khan sent his armies across Asia, their victories were recorded in numbers. So many soldiers slain, so many prisoners taken, so many cities turned to ash. But the numbers hide the deeper conquest. For each city burned, there were women carried away. For each rival leader executed, there were wives and daughters absorbed into the horde. Some became queens in gilded captivity. Others became concubines, their lives forgotten even as they bore sons who would one day rule. Still others vanished altogether, their names erased, their suffering unrecorded. This silence was deliberate, for to acknowledge their presence was to acknowledge the intimacy of conquest, the ways in which empire carved itself not just onto land, but into the most private and human of bonds. It is tempting to see Genghis Khan as a figure of brutal genius, a man of steel will and unmatched strategy, and in many ways he was. He united fractured tribes into a force of terrifying discipline. He outmaneuvered empires that thought themselves invincible. He created systems of communication, law, and trade that transformed the medieval world. But beneath the brilliance lay something darker, an insatiable hunger that did not stop at borders. His empire expanded into the very veins of humanity. His children were not only the result of his marriage to Berta, not only the offspring of royal unions. They were the children of countless women taken through conquest, women who had no choice but to carry his blood into the future. The haunting truth is that the empire of Genghis Khan lives on not in monuments, not in banners, but in DNA. 16 million men carry his mark. That means 16 million stories, 16 million lineages, all converging back to one man whose power was expressed not only through armies, but through flesh. This is not the legacy of one family. It is the legacy of systemic domination, repeated over and over across continents, until the genetic footprint became inescapable. And yet, if his blood is everywhere, where are the women? Why do we not know their names? Berta is remembered because she was his queen, because she bore his heirs. His daughters are remembered because they ruled territories wielding power in his name. But beyond them, there is only silence. The Persian princesses carried away into his court, the noble daughters of Khwarazm who disappeared into his camp, the Chinese wives of rival rulers who were forced to bear his lineage. They are gone from the record, their voices extinguished. Their lives mattered only in the children they produced, children who were absorbed into the vast machinery of empire. This erasure is itself a form of conquest. For what greater domination can there be than to strip someone of not only their freedom, but their memory? The women of Genghis Khan's empire were not permitted to exist in history as individuals. They exist only as shadows, as anonymous mothers, as faceless vessels of power. And yet their blood remains. It flows through millions, even if their names are gone. Think of the weight of this. Every marketplace in Central Asia, every crowded street in the Middle East, every town along the Silk Road, within those crowds are descendants of women whose lives were consumed by the will of one man. They live without knowing it, carrying the blood of conquest in their veins. It is a legacy both haunting and inescapable, a reminder that empire does not only live in stone and steel, but in the most intimate fabric of human life. Genghis Khan's genius lay in seeing the world as a battlefield with no boundaries. His cruelty lay in making even human intimacy a weapon. By taking the wives of rivals, by absorbing their daughters, he not only destroyed bloodlines but rewrote them. His conquest was total, leaving nothing untouched. That is why his empire, though gone, continues to haunt the present. For though the Mongol banners fell, though the empire crumbled into successor states, his blood still endures, 16 million strong. His true monument is not a palace, not a temple, not even a battlefield. His true monument is humanity itself, reshaped in his image. And yet in this triumph of legacy lies a shadow so heavy it cannot be ignored. His bloodline survives, but the women who bore it remain invisible. Their suffering was the price of his immortality. Their silence was the foundation of his legend. Without them, his empire would not have endured. Without them, there would be no 16 million men walking today with his blood. And still, they are forgotten. The story of Genghis Khan is remembered as a tale of power, ambition, and conquest. But beneath that story lies another, darker one. The story of women silenced by history, women whose lives were consumed to create a legacy that outlived them. This is the true cost of empire. This is the silence that endures long after the banners have fallen. The shadow of Genghis Khan stretches farther than any empire in history. Not because of the lands he conquered, not because of the cities he reduced to ash, but because of what he planted in silence, in secrecy, in the intimate chambers of his power. To understand the true terror of his reign, one must look not only at the carnage of the battlefield, but at the quiet aftermath, when armies dispersed and dust settled, when women were left behind in the wreckage of broken dynasties, pulled into a destiny they never chose. Imagine a princess of Khwarazm, once adorned in silks, raised to think of herself as untouchable, the daughter of a mighty Shah. Her palace burns, her brothers lie slaughtered, her father hunted like an animal. She is dragged across deserts to a tent not her own, her future rewritten in a single night. No chronicle remembers her name. No epic poem sings of her sorrow. But her blood became part of the empire. Her sons, if they survived, would be Mongol princes. Her daughters would be traded again, binding rival clans into submission. And she herself would vanish from history, her voice silenced, her story extinguished. Yet without her, without countless others like her, the empire would have lacked its binding glue. Consider the Chinese noblewoman, her family's banners trampled under Mongol hooves. Once her life was dictated by rituals, poetry, and ceremony. Now it is dictated by the command of a man she never chose, a man whose language she may not even understand. She bears his child, and in that child the blood of China and Mongolia mix. That child grows to wield authority, to govern provinces, to lead men in battle. The mother fades into obscurity, her name erased even in her own land. But her blood remains, carried forward through her son. And though she is forgotten, she has become part of the great reshaping of humanity. This was conquest not written in stone, but inscribed in the body. The empire of Genghis Khan spread in flesh as much as in fire. To be taken into his household or into the households of his generals was to become part of a machine larger than comprehension. Women became bridges, their children binding tribes to khans, their wombs transforming enemies into heirs. Some bore the weight of queenship, others the invisibility of concubinage. But all were caught in the same current, the unstoppable tide of one man's ambition. And what of Berta, the first wife, the queen who began it all? She endured kidnapping in her youth, her body claimed by strangers before Temujin fought to win her back. That wound never left her, for even within her own tent, she would see other women brought in. Rivals, prisoners, strangers forced to share the space of wifehood with her. The legitimacy of her children was questioned because of her early abduction. Whispers of Yoki's paternity never fading, and still she stood beside him, the silent mother of an empire. She had power, yes, but it was power shadowed by pain. Her story is remembered, but even hers is told through the lens of what she gave to Genghis Khan: heirs, loyalty, stability. Rarely do we hear of her suffering, her silence, her resilience in the face of an endless tide of other women drawn into her husband's orbit. The chronicles do not dwell on these stories. They glorify battles, chart genealogies, praise strategies. They tell us of cities destroyed, populations slaughtered, kings humbled. But they do not tell us of the countless women whose lives were rewritten in fire and blood. And yet it is through those women that the empire lives on. Their voices may be absent, but their blood is everywhere. 16 million men, perhaps more, carry the genetic signature of Genghis Khan. 16 million lives tied, unknowingly, to the silence of women long forgotten. Think of that number. 16 million. It is the population of entire nations. 16 million men alive today, each with a strand of DNA that traces back to a man who died 8 centuries ago. It is as though he refused to die, as though he found a way to cheat death itself, embedding himself in humanity so deeply that he could never be erased. And yet he could not have done this alone. He required the bodies of others, the wombs of women taken through conquest. Without them, his blood would have withered. Without them, there would be no genetic empire. This is the true darkness of his legacy. We marvel at his strategies, his vision, his ability to bend the world to his will. But what we should also see is the invisible suffering that built his immortality. His victories were carved on the backs of women, their silence forming the foundation of his eternal presence. They had no choice. They had no voice. And yet they are the reason he lives on. Even now, centuries later, when his empire has long since fractured, when his descendants warred with each other and his dynasty splintered into ashes, the blood remains. In markets in Samarkand, in villages in Afghanistan, in towns in China, in steppes of Mongolia, in cities across the Middle East. His descendants walk, unknowing heirs of empire. They are the living monuments to a man whose conquest was not only of land but of flesh. But monuments usually have names carved in stone. His monument does not. His monument is faceless, silent, anonymous. The women who bore it were erased, their suffering unspoken. That is why the story of Genghis Khan will always carry a shadow deeper than that of any battlefield. For the empire of blood is an empire built on silence, an empire built on forgotten cries, an empire that haunts us still. And so when we ask if Genghis Khan's children still exist, the answer is not only yes, it is everywhere. They live in the millions. They walk unnoticed in crowds, their faces blending with those around them. They are teachers, farmers, merchants, workers, rulers. They are ordinary men with an extraordinary lineage. But what we must never forget is the cost. Each life tied to that bloodline carries within it the echo of women who were never allowed to tell their story. Women who became unwilling architects of a legacy too vast to escape. That is the darkness history rarely acknowledges. Genghis Khan does not live only in books or statues or chronicles. He lives in us. He lives in the veins of millions who never asked for his shadow, never asked for his story. And in that shadow, the silence of women endures. A silence so heavy it can never truly be lifted, only felt generation after generation, like a whisper carried across centuries. The empire is gone, but the blood remains, and with it, the haunting truth. Some conquests never end.